Hello everyone and welcome to a brand new episode of Cobble Icons. Today's episode, as you'll see by the title and the description and the thumbnail, if you've taken any notice of it, don't worry, that's absolutely fine, is none other than the inimitable Mrs Hilda Ogden, one of my favourites. Before I proceed, just to let you know, this episode will be carried over two different episodes because there's a lot of things to get through and I don't like to keep you for very long. And so to make sure that you're notified of episode 2, or should I say part 2 of this, make sure that you're subscribed and hit your notification bell to tell you that I've uploaded. As always, I've checked a few different sources to verify the details of this character profile. I feel by doing these episodes it keeps the characters and the actors that play the characters alive, even though they've gone to the other realm now. I think it's very important because let's not forget, creating these characters and the whole production of Coronation Street, it is a huge form of art, and I believe that by keeping these stories alive it raises the profile of the art that is continual drama. So as this episode is going to be one of those fonder ones, why don't you pause me just now, go grab a drink, grab a drink, get some nibbles and get comfy as we take a magical trip down memory lane, or street should I say. Hilda Ogden, played by Jean Alexander, made her first appearance on the 8th of July 1964, 57 years ago. She was born on the 2nd of February 1924 as Hilda Alice Crabtree to parents Arnold and Florence. She was the youngest of 3 siblings, her older siblings being Archie and Norman. Of course, back in the 1920s, mums tended to stay at home while the fathers went out to work, and Hilda's father worked as an embalmer. And so this kind of put the Crabtree family into one of the poorer classes, because obviously when you have one parent that's bringing in the wages to the house, it doesn't really afford you some of the other luxuries in life. In the early days of the family, Hilda and her siblings and her parents lived in the slums of Manchester, although her mum did keep her particular slum, or her house, very clean. She ran an exemplary family. As a child, Hilda didn't have a lot of friends, although later on in life she did reminisce about her good friend Ronnie Pickles, which was like, I suppose, what you would call nowadays one of her close gal pals. At aged 15, Hilda left school to go and work in a local funeral directors called Spencer's, and around this time when World War II broke out, she worked in the munitions factory whilst living in Continual Street with her mother and father. Now, during her teenage years and getting close to her 20s, she did have a few different romances, but then aged 22, she would bump into her future husband in the most unlikely of settings. During an air raid in 1943, she was helping her very, very drunk boyfriend, then called Harry Battersby, home after a night out in the pub. Suddenly the street lighting went out and the whole place was plunged into complete darkness, so of course Hilda couldn't really see where on earth she was going, what she was walking into, or who she could be bumping into. And this must have been a little bit scary for her because, as I said, it was complete darkness and she was over a mile from home. Although somehow in complete darkness she did manage to find her way to Crimea Street, and she passed her local cooperative. Now, for people that don't know what a cooperative is, it's like a convenience store that sells bits and bobs of everything, like food and household items and such. And when she was walking there, she actually tripped over what she thought was a pile of clothing. That was until the clothing started to move. What she'd actually stumbled upon was a very inebriated Stanley Ogden, and he was recovering from his drinking session in the pub, taking shelter on some clothing. He'd been in the pub and doing the thing that he loved, drinking beer, and he was actually doing a drinking competition. And so he was feeling a bit worse for wear, and he just had no option but to recover in the street until he sobered up. And so, yeah, Hilda actually fell into him in the street, and she ended up kicking him in the stomach in the process. And so when she realised that obviously she'd kicked someone in the stomach, she got Stanley to his feet, and at that time when she saw him, now bearing in mind it's quite dark in the street because all the lights went out, she actually likened him to a young Clark Gable, a very handsome gentleman. And so they both journeyed along to the shelter and got chatting for the night as they made their way to the refuge. But whatever they did 6 days after that, or the interim period of time, it must have been something magical, because just six days later they were married. And so Mrs Hilda Ogden, a Cobble icon, was born. It was said that on their first night of wedded bliss, it didn't go quite as they'd planned, because, now call this a passion killer or whatever you like, but the military police soon knocked on the door to arrest Stanley. Stan had been arrested for overstaying his leave by 4 days from the army, and so he was whipped away back. Now, as we get further into this episode, as Hilda was so very close to Stan, Stan will be referenced quite a lot, but yet I will steer this episode kind of in Hilda's perspective, because you can't talk about Hilda and not mention Stan a lot, because he was like half her life. He was everything to her. Now, after the whirlwind of marrying Stan, Hilda took up residence in Stan's parents' house, and Stan's mother, Mary Ogden, took to Hilda very quickly. When the two Mrs Ogdens first met up after the marriage, Hilda and Mary went into Mrs Ogden's front parlour, which, if anyone doesn't know, the houses in Weatherfield and some in the real Manchester, the front parlour is like a room at the front of the house. It's usually on the downstairs floor, and it is just saved for the best of occasions, or the most worst of occasions, really. So things like weddings, funerals, because usually if your religious beliefs meant that the deceased person would come home so people could view the body, the coffin was held in that room, or for parties, or just any sort of special occasion. That room was saved for best, and it contained all the best that the house had to offer. Yeah, and so any other time, the room just remained untouched to anything and everything. So for that meeting to take place in that particular room, that is quite a big thing. It's a bit like the ultimate mark of respect when you're taken into the front parlour. And so the two Mrs Ogdens had tea and light refreshments in the front parlour, and they got on like a house on fire, which is always great when you're trying getting to know your mother-in-law. Yeah, the two Mrs Ogdens were very similar in nature, and Mrs Ogden just approved of her daughter-in-law entirely and completely spoiled her rotten. Now, around this time, Hilda actually thought that she was pregnant, although she didn't know at the time, but it was just a false alarm, and she didn't actually tell Mary Ogden that it was a false alarm, because she didn't really want to disappoint Mary, because I suppose Mrs Ogden would have been quite looking forward to having a grandchild. But when Mary found out that she'd been lied to, she threw Hilda out of the house. Hilda actually had to relocate to Charles Street until Stan came home from his war duties. Now, speaking of children, a little bit of trivia here for you. Originally, when Stan and Hilda came to Coronation Street, it was said that they had 4 children and not 2. Although this wasn't actually reflected on in the rest of their time in the street. The ones that we originally knew about were called Dudley, Frida, Tony and Sylvia. Later on, Dudley and Frida were renamed Irma and Trevor. And originally it was said that the other 2 children were actually taken into care because Stan had beat them so severely that the council had just taken them away from them. They were actually fully intended to appear in the whole series, but in 1964 ITV had a writer's strike, so that meant that those 2 characters couldn't be properly created. And then after this, they were only merely hinted at in the scripts. And then in the 1970s, Hilda said that she only had 2 children. And so the time after that, it would appear that the other 2 children just no longer existed. Yeah, and so Frida and Dudley had changed their names to Irma and Trevor, although I couldn't find out why that was, what the reason was. So if anyone knows, please, if you could let me know in the comments, I'd really appreciate that. And so we come to the 1960s, and by 1960, Hilda had really tired of her husband Stan of working the long-distance lorry driver jobs that he'd been doing for a while. She felt quite lonely and was also feeling the strain of raising 2 children pretty much on her own with no help. What she actually did was she threatened that if he didn't get a different job, that she would leave him. And in my opinion, maybe she should have done that, but never mind, just my opinion. But with Stan being Stan, as the years progressed, Stan kind of decided that work wasn't really for him. Work just eluded him completely. He just left pretty much all of the responsibilities of things like bills and money and keeping a roof over their head to just leaving that as like an everlasting burden to Hilda. So that's pretty much the backstory before they arrived in Coronation Street in 1964. And in 1964, Stan and Hilda bought number 13 Coronation Street. 13, unlucky for some, eh? And so number 13 Coronation Street was right next to the corner shop, which is quite handy, isn't it? Having literally a corner shop on the doorstep. A plus for them was that number 13 had recently been rewired, so they wouldn't have the inconvenience of having that done in the near future. And so Stan put all his life savings, which was over £200, and took out a mortgage for £325 to buy the house. Now, Hilda, she absolutely loved her house, and she kind of saw it as her own little palace, and did anything and everything that she could to make it really comfortable and just her own, and put her own stamp on it. She tried to persuade Stan on many occasions to make home improvements to the place, but again, he was just too lazy, just wasn't interested. Although later on in this episode he did make quite a significant change, so stick around for that. And so as they settled into number 13, Hilda quickly found work as a cleaner at the Rover's Return, which was at the other end of the street, and she was a cleaner at the pub, with Annie Walker being landlady at the helm, and Mrs Walker ran a pretty tight ship. As Hilda worked, she would often be found singing, very differently of course, and if I can find it I will pop in a clip of Mrs Ogden singing. Now, as I said previously, Stan, he didn't really want to work or find the work after he was demobbed. By the mid to late 60s he'd worked as a milkman, a chauffeur, and as a waste paper businessman, and so Hilda was the one left responsible for finding work, finding money, keeping a roof over their heads, food in their bellies, and not a lot else really. And Hilda also had to earn the money for Stan's favourite hobby of all time, drinking beer in the Rovers pub. Now, with very little attention at home and not a lot of interesting topics or hobbies of her own, Hilda took up her own hobby, and that was being the local gossip, although she would never admit that to anyone. She would always pop up whenever something major happened in the street to find out exactly what happened, and then to spread the news to the other neighbours and friends. This was her favourite thing to do. Yeah, she was always keen on what her neighbours were getting up to and down to. Although when Hilda spoke, she had this knack of getting her words ever so slightly wrong. In fact, she was quite famous for it. As Stan not so eloquently put it, she had a terrible knack for mucking up the Queen's English. For instance, there was a time where Stan and Hilda were talking about the royal family and their staff, and instead of saying the word equerry, Hilda instead used the words aquarium, which I find really funny. Oh, bless her. Now, as Hilda made her way through life during the mid and later 60s, she started to grow a little bit fed up and tired of life. Her husband was just a complete layabout, only interested in what the world could offer him, never really thinking about what he could offer the world. And so, yeah, Hilda just kind of had to make her own entertainment, really, just to get her through life. When she looked around and she saw some of her neighbours, for instance, the infamous Elsie Tanner, in comparison with Hilda's life, she saw like Elsie's life as quite adventurous and exciting. Outwardly, she gave the impression that she just did not like Elsie at all, and she felt she was common as muck and a little bit too lavish to herself when it came to things like men. Although behind closed doors and the net curtains, she really kind of aspired to be her slightly. Yeah, so in short, she was a little bit jealous of Elsie. Now, in 1967, Hilda actually went missing on a day trip to her cousin's. She had gone missing with actually accumulated money from a club. Stan, being the suspicious person that he usually was, thought that this was purposeful, and Hilda had gone missing with the money, that she'd stole it. And yeah, he just thought that she'd stole the money and there just had to be another man involved, because what else could possibly tear her away from her amazing husband. I mean, this is Hilda that we're talking about. There's no way that she would, go off with another man. That just wasn't her at all. She was completely devoted to her lazy, unloving husband for some bizarre reason. Yeah, they say that love makes you do the funniest things. I mean, me personally, I couldn't settle for a relationship that didn't bring me anything of value to my life. I don't mean money, I mean things like love, encouragement, support, things like that. Money would be a bonus, but yeah, I wouldn't settle for that personally. But Hilda did, her vows meant a lot to her. Now, after being missing for a whole week, she was actually found on a pier in Liverpool in a very emotional and confused state. She was later diagnosed by a psychiatrist for having had an emotional breakdown with paranoid psychosis, and for a television show to do that in the 1960s, which is like a recurring theme in Coronation Street, but especially the 1960s when mental health wasn't a thing, was a very brave and amazing thing for Coronation Street to do, to highlight what mental health is, in my opinion anyway. Now, this diagnosis, it kind of explained partially her jealousy over Elsie, because usually jealousy wasn't a thing for Hilda. She was quite content with what she had. I mean, she had aspirations to have more in life, but, you know, really deep down jealousy wasn't really Hilda's thing. And when she woke up in the hospital after being found, she didn't really remember any of this, being on the pier or going away. She just woke up in the hospital in the care of the professionals, and yeah, just couldn't remember any of it. Although this health scare, it really did, for once, spur Stan into looking after Hilda for once, and he really cared for her during this time and the period of time that she recovered at home. Which is quite nice to see, because when all you're really used to seeing is Stan just not giving a damn, when it does turn out that he does actually care for her and you know, does look after her, it is really nice to see. And it's probably one of the most attentive times that he's ever spent with Hilda. Now, in early 1968, Hilda began a friendship with a man called George, but she felt that she soon had to put a stop to that. Although the relationship was strictly platonic, Hilda still felt that she was betraying Stan in some way, because it was still spending time with another man. She still felt she was betraying him, so she felt she had to put a stop to it. Which just goes to show really how much she valued and believed in her wedding vows. Now, later on that year, Hilda's daughter Irma, who by this point had married David Barlow, who was the younger brother of Ken Barlow, announced that she and David were leaving the UK to emigrate to Australia. Naturally, Hilda was heartbroken, but Irma and David felt that they wanted to, well, David mainly wanted to relaunch his career as a footballer after doing himself an injury in the UK. He felt that if he moved to Australia, he could, just relaunch his football career over there. And like I said, Hilda was quite distraught, because she'd not always had the best of relationship with Irma. And she just kind of wanted Irma to stay exactly where she was, so that she could spend a lot of time with her and build on the relationship, and just to make the whole dynamic of the relationship a lot better. But when she realised that there was no point in trying to stop her, and that David and Irma were going to go, Hilda actually wanted her and Stan to go with them. But Stan just point blank refused and said, "No, absolutely not, I am not going to Australia, I'm staying right here in England." So that put paid to Hilda's plans to move to the Southern Hemisphere, really. Although there was some joy later on that year when Hilda's first grandson, Darren, was born. Now, around this time, Stan bought over a window cleaning round from a local independent trader and started up a window cleaning round of his own. And he had his own cart. It was like a wooden cart, so there was no, van or anything to take around his cleaning materials. It was just an old wooden cart and a bucket and a sponge and a wiper, and that was it. Although Stan being Stan, he didn't make the most of this business, because it did involve actual physical work. Although it did start one of the longer running jobs in Coronation Street history, and most of which was at Hilda's expense, but I'll come into that just shortly. Now, way back in the 60s, predominantly it would be just women staying at home looking after the house and the children, and so they would be responsible for things like cleaning the windows. So if they didn't have the time or capacity to do that, they would pay people like Stan to come and clean the windows. So naturally, Stan had a lot of female customers, and one of these customers in particular, as Hilda put it, was at number 19 Flaming Rotten Inkerman Street. Anyone remember that? Yeah, and so the running joke was that Stan had this extramarital affair every time that he cleaned number 19 Inkerman Street. And whenever there was like an argument between Hilda and one of the other residents of Coronation Street, one of the ladies really, they would bring up the subject of 19 Inkerman Street, and that was like a bit of ammunition that they could throw back at Hilda to say, well, your life's not exactly perfect, is it? Because your husband goes to number 19 Inkerman Street when he cleans windows for, a bit of extra, you know what. And yeah, people often teased Stan, people like Len Fairclough and Ray Langton. They said, how's that bit at 19 Inkerman Street? But Stan would always completely deny it and just shut them down. Now we get to the end of the 1960s and the Ogdens were really feeling the strain financially. Again, another running feature in their life. And there was also more heartache on the way, unfortunately, for Stan and Hilda. Now, the new decade in the 70s brought heartache as there was a terrible accident in the family. Whilst in Australia, Irma, David and their son Darren was involved in a really bad car accident. Irma was fine. She was just suffering from things like shock and, a few minor injuries. Whilst her husband David and their young son Darren had died from their injuries. And so what happened was, because the funeral was going to take place in Australia, Stan and Hilda had to borrow £600 for the flight to get to Australia because there was no way that they had £600 lying around anywhere. But thankfully the locals all clubbed together to fund this for them, which is really nice when you see a sense of community. Now, as I said before, the 70s brought some memorable occasions for the Ogdens. As I said, Hilda was quite fed up with the way that her house wasn't being looked after, and Stan was also being teased for not doing any improvements to the house. So Stan, in his wisdom, decided, okay, I'm going to build, or rather attempt to build, a servant hatch that was from the front parlour to their lounge. And so Stan set out to work with his sledgehammer and began knocking this huge hole in the wall for the servant hatch. But the trouble was, they didn't actually use their front parlour. Remember I said before that the front parlour wasn't used for anything apart from huge occasions? They would always eat in their lounge. So you had the kitchen here, the lounge here, and the front parlour here. And so how were they going to use the servant hatch? The answer was that they wouldn't. And a few measuring mistakes meant that Stan had built probably the world's biggest servant hatch. If you don't know what a servant hatch is, it's just like a hole in the wall that's got doors that open and shut, and whenever a meal's being served, you open the door, hand the tray through and say, there's your dinner, or tea, or lunch, or breakfast, or whatever. But this hatch, it was almost the size of the whole wall. I'll put a picture up here. It's ridiculous. And so when people came in to inspect the servant hatch, people like Minnie Caldwell and Ina Sharples, they pretty much just laughed at Stan's efforts. Bless him. He tried. Now, I keep saying, heartache and things. Now, in 1972, there was a Peeping Tom going about the streets in Coronation Street and the surrounding area, and Stan was actually accused of being this Peeping Tom. The reason being is because around the time of one of these incidents happened, Stan was seen in the back ginnel. Now, the ginnel was like a pathway that's at the back of the house, at the other side of their yard gates. And because he was seen around that time, people started accusing Stan of being this Peeping Tom, which of course he wasn't. Ultimately, the real culprit was found. He was named and shamed in the local paper, and people were left having to really eat huge portions of humble pie because they had Hilda and Stan's neighbours accusing, Stan of being a Peeping Tom was probably one of the worst things that they could accuse Stan of being, and they were just completely angry at the thought that their neighbours and friends, what they thought were friends, were accusing Stan of being this Peeping Tom. So that really hurt them for a bit. And so for a while, people had to really come and apologise, which was really difficult for people like Billy Walker to do. Billy Walker being a person that had a lot of sort of chauvinistic male pride, that I would describe it as. Yeah, so this accusation was just completely appalling to them. But eventually that kind of went away, and that was the end of that storyline. Now, during the time all of this happened, there was a famous scene when Hilda marched into the Rovers and said, I've got something to say to you all. It pretty much went along the lines of, you're not good enough to lick my husband's boots. And she went and spat on the floor, to the lot of you. And yeah, that was one of the more famous Hilda Ogden scenes. And when she was doing that, she was kind of pointing out all the, the sort of shady mistakes that the people in the pub were making, people that were accusing, Stan of doing this act. And she said, you're not all innocent. You've got no right to talk. Yeah, and that was that. Now, moving on to the mid-70s, and in 1975, with, the economic recession hitting, Hilda found herself going out to work more and more and more because, of course, Stan was a layabout, wasn't interested in work, wasn't interested in helping Hilda with getting money in the house and feeding them, clothing them. And yes, she had to work more and more. But in 1975, Stan became quite ill. He was actually that ill that he wasn't even drinking his beloved beer. So, there was definitely something seriously wrong if Stanley Ogden's not drinking his beer. He actually collapsed in the street, later being diagnosed with otitis media. Otitis media is like a swelling of the inner middle part of the ear, which can cause things like redness, inflammation, and swelling, nausea, lethargy. Sounds a bit like a hangover to me, but that's what he was diagnosed with, so we must go with that. But because Stan hadn't been paying his national insurance for the last 6 months, the only sickness benefit he was getting was £7 a week. And so, yet again, it was up to Hilda to get more and more work, and she started taking in washing from the Mark Britton warehouse. That was a warehouse that was opposite their house before it was turned into Baldwin's Casuals, and then in the 90s that was demolished. But that's another whole episode. If you want me to do it, let me know in the comments. And Hilda actually did Stan's window cleaning round, and when she was doing that, she met a man called Eddie Yates. This was one of the more unlikely friendships that Coronation Street's quite good at doing. And yeah, so that relationship developed, and in years to come, Eddie would be seen by Hilda as like a sort of a son that she never had, because Eddie Yates, he did treat Hilda like an adoptive mother, I would say. He did really care about her. And so Hilda would always go to like the ends of the earth outside of number 13 to protect Eddie. Because Eddie was classed as a bit of an underdog. He'd had criminal convictions, he spent time in prison. And like in the 1970s, I mean, I'm not saying that stigma is completely eradicated now, because it hasn't, but more so in the 1970s, when people had things like criminal convictions, spent time in prison, they weren't really given a lot of opportunity at all really in life, be it personal opportunities or employment opportunities. And so the relationship between Hilda, Stan and Eddie kind of progressed, and it was like a whole new dynamic at number 13. And as the 70s drew to a close, so does this part of the episode. If you're interested in part 2, that will be available tomorrow. And yeah, so make sure that you're subscribed and you've hit the notification bell so you're fully aware when it goes up, so you don't miss out on anything. And coming up in part 2 of the episode, we have really memorable moments for the inimitable Mrs Hilda Ogden, which include her beloved Muriel, and yeah, some more emotional times ahead for Hilda. So with that being said, I shall bid farewell just now, and I shall see you tomorrow. Ta-ra, chalk.